Hello and welcome to Critical Readings, episode 331 for the 13th of July, 2026. I'm Dr. Sean Philip Cooper, and with me today I have Dr. Drew Nathaniel Keene
Salutations.
and Lane Haygood.
Hello, as always.
Good afternoon, gentlemen. Well, we are today going to be looking at the first part, indeed the first, 7 chapters? Yes, the first 8 chapters of The Ill-Made Knight. And this is the third book of The Once and Future King by T.H. White. And then, of course, next week we'll be looking at the second third of the book. And then on the following week, we'll be looking at the last third of the book. And that will take us to I'm sorry, did I say third? Good heavens, I've divided this into 5 parts. So it's the first fifth of the book today. We're 20% of the way through. It's a much longer book than The Queen of Air and Darkness. And it's even longer than The Sword and the Stone. The Queen of Air and Darkness is short, though. I don't think we mentioned
Queen
this.
of Air and Darkness doesn't even seem like a complete book to me. It feels like a hallway from one book to another.
Well, so when it was The Witch in the Wood, it was a complete book. But then it became The Queen of Air and Darkness, and it became much smaller. In The Queen of Air and Darkness, White cut it down significantly. He didn't remove any plot points as such, so it's not like in The Sword and the Stone where there were things that were taken out and things that were added in. But it was much contracted. And sometimes for White's prose, that's useful, because he has a tendency, as we've discussed in previous episodes and as we'll find today, when he gets an inventory in front of him, a list of things, he loves that very much. He's a man who would be perfectly happy to be a quartermaster, I think. That would bring him great joy. So we'll see today that he does the same thing at the beginning of The Ill-Made Knight. He does like an inventory. And I think we should talk about why that is, but we'll get to that in due course, because first we do have a comment, and it is from episode 330, which was the final episode on The Queen of Air and Darkness. And it's from Mao, who is in our Discord chat, and who also messages to us on Discord. So remember, listeners, if you'd like to be in our Discord chat and have conversations with other supporters and with us ourselves, you need to become a patron of Critical Readings, and you can do that by going to our website, criticalreadings.com, and clicking Become a Patron at the top of the page. It'll give you early access to the podcast. We post links there as soon as they're edited, and you can also participate in our discussion forums and our voting forums for our Reader's Choice episodes. But here's what Mao had to say. Hello again, Critical Readings. When I read Queen of Air and Darkness, I did find in it a very strange digression, not wholly unwelcome. I can understand the focus on the Orkney boys, because it seems that White correctly identified the main downfall of the Round Table as stemming from them and the factionalists and so on and so forth. I have grown in appreciation for the sequence of murdering the unicorn for some sensible reasons, and for another that was a mere hallucination of my own, for the real ones. I think we are meant to view the unicorn as analogous to Arthur, or perhaps Arthur's dream for the British Isles, a very regal, pure being, complete with its own powerful sword, the horn, that nevertheless is gentle and meek in the presence of someone seeking peace, the virgin they brought along with them, whose name escapes me. Those aware of the coat of arms of the United Kingdom should know that one of the supporters, as in literally one of the figures on the sides of the shield that support it from the sides, is a unicorn, right? The lion and the unicorn. Who is the mythological national animal of Scotland itself? With mentioning on the coat of arms, it's actually a chained unicorn. On the one hand, it could be that the unicorn represents Scotland itself, but I don't think that was White's intent. Rather, I do think the unicorn must represent Arthur, who in turn is also destroyed by one of the Orkney boys, Mordred. I know it differs between adaptations if Arthur is slain with a spear, or if it is Mordred who is slain with a spear, but in either case, Arthur's demise always involves a spear somehow. Please do let me know of any of the original texts that might shed light on the matter. I think in Mallory, the spear kills Arthur. And, of course, Morgause also lured a unicorn in her youth. And then who does she seduce later? Arthur, although he is the virgin in this situation, not the other way round. Now for the hallucination. In some versions of Arthuriana, Arthur has a spear called Roan Gimniad, or Rome Gimniat. I had a discussion a long time ago with some friends trying to work out what the word meant. And I believe, talking with a linguist friend, he thought it sounded Greek. Indeed, rhin is a root word for nose in Greek. Rhine, no, that's in rhinoceros and rhinoplasty. So somewhere along the line, I thought that meant rhino-piercer, which sounded like a fine name for a legendary spear. And what is the unicorn but perhaps a confusion of the rhinoceros? I thought it was quite interesting and neat that Arthur may have been killed by the rhino-piercer, just as the Orkney boys pierced their own mythological rhino in the Queen of Air and Darkness. Alas, rhino-gymniad is not Greek, but Welsh, I believe. I've forgotten what it meant, but surely not rhino-piercer. I will blame my hallucination on partially wanting there to be more legendary spears in the great works of literature. So many swords, too many swords. Where are the lances and pikes and javelins? Well, there's the Guenever spear, of course, right? And then there's the Lance of Destiny. So there are some famous spears now. I am very much enjoying the series. Good health to the panel, and I hope the summer heat waves don't strike you down as they are to the Isles right now. Thanks, and my apologies for spelling and diction errors. All right, well, thank you for that, Mao. He got it in just before the clock. So we appreciate you making the effort to make sure that we got to read your comment. And you've made some great points. I really like this idea of Arthur and the unicorn. I think that's a really fantastic observation and really well done. And I to be brutally frank, I hadn't even thought of that before. But there absolutely is a parallel that, they're trying to bring this to their mother. They kill the thing, they mangle it, even though they care about it. And then, of course, Agravain is brutal. He doesn't really care about it. He just wants to destroy it. And that is actually the attitude of all the boys towards the Round Table. Gawain, Gareth, and Garrus, they do care about it, but they mangle it in various ways. And Agravain doesn't care about it at all and is involved in destroying it. What do you think, Drew?
No, I think it's a good point. It seems plausible to me that the unicorn is a kind of a symbol for the Round Table, the idealism of it. It's also a very self-flattering picture of the British Empire. Even though we do have these Scottish characters, he almost never names Scotland. It's just taken for granted that this is an extension of England, and a very difficult one to that.
Yeah, well, I think that the idea of England itself doesn't even really exist. I mean, it's grammary, right? It's not England yet.
But he talks about England all the time. England comes up in the text frequently, whereas Scotland almost never shows up in the text.
Well, yes.
Orkney does.
But again, the kind of England he's talking about is a fictional England.
Oh, absolutely. The British empires are kind of fictional England, right? It amalgamates all of the North Atlantic Isles to itself.
Indeed. Well, we get this in the later chapters of today's reading, right? There's a long discussion, and of course the White does his thing where he mentions some real kings and then describes them as fictional. He loves to do that. The purely fictional kings of the Franks, right? The purely fictional kings of England. Not the real kings like, Arthur and Uther. Those are the real kings until you get to the modern era.
Uther the Conqueror.
Uther
right?
the Conqueror, indeed, who reigned for some 200 years. Right? And so there's this interesting, we have to wonder to what degree White is serious about his depiction of England and his romanticism of it, right? And I think that this deliberate setting aside, this pretending that fictional England is real England and real England is fictional England, is a way of bracketing it and kind of signposting to us that it's not real. But in the context of this book, it's a sort of fairy story. Like, imagine what it would have been like. Maybe it could have been real. And that's probably something that Arthur would like to think about his own Camelot, right? If he were around today, what if it could have been real? Because ultimately it fails as well, just as the British Empire.
No, I think
fails.
he's quite purposefully trying to present it as fantastical and to make it abundantly clear to the readers that this is an idealized picture. But it's the ways in which he plays with what's true that I think reveals some of his own serious blind spots about England itself, the real England.
That's certainly the case, right? And we also have some peculiarities to the writing style. And we've mentioned these before, and I think we should spend a little time on it today because we've kind of remarked on back in The Sword and the Stone, for example, where there's a few of them in both versions of the text. In the Madame Mim section that was excised from the omnibus edition, the tetralogy, the Madame Mim section also contains a long inventory, which I mentioned when we were discussing that. But there's an inventory in the Ill-Made Knight of the armory at the castle where Lancelot and Uncle Dap live and practice. And we get a very, very long inventory. And I don't know that the contents of the inventory as such need to preoccupy us today, but I do want to talk about why those inventories are there. And I think there's a couple different reasons. And they're fairly simplistic. One of them is that White, who also edited a bestiary, which is like a kind of inventory itself, right? It's a long list of animals, fictional and not. White is fascinated by these sort of collations of medieval things. And he thinks, and you may agree or disagree, he thinks that they give us a picture of the world that is in some ways truer than a selective redaction that we might make about in describing a scene today, which is going to be much more tight and narratively focused. And we're going to talk about the things that matter immediately. And I think to White, that kind of elides a sort of whole picture of what it's like to live in the medieval era. And this comes from Braudel and the French Annales School of History, which is interested in looking not just at like the central figures of history, but also the lives of ordinary people in his Mediterranean world. That is what Braudel does. Now, I should point out that Braudel plays fast and loose with his sources, and he's not a perfect proponent of this himself, but this becomes associated with him. And I think that White is trying to do something similar. He's giving us a complete and total inventory for us to kind of see at all the ordinary things that make up life in a medieval armory or in a wizard's laboratory or in a tutor's study or in the castle of a minor baron. And we can draw from this, we can sort of in our minds, we can kind of work backwards about all the different people who would be necessary to create these things and maintain them and provide them. And then you can sort of reconstruct the society backwards, right? You can do it in reverse. And so I think that's why he's doing this. And, you know, apart from it being fascinating to him, we have to know, like, why is it fascinating to him, or is he just obsessive compulsive? And I don't think that's the case. I think it really is just a matter of painting a big picture and trying to get at the details of medieval life, because that's how, working backwards, we can understand the larger picture of medieval life itself. What do you think, Drew?
Well, I think your account of what he thought he was doing is probably right. I think the execution is rather sloppy. I mean, it doesn't quite work because, for one thing, he's taking bits and pieces from all different parts of the medieval, which is a span of like 1,000 years, and mashing them all together. So you don't get a picture of any one time period. And then for the sake of humor, he's also pulling in things that, you know, come post-medieval, even all the way up into the 20th century, into his own time. So that what you get is a kind of hodgepodge that doesn't, the material culture artifacts that are there and that get attention don't amount to a clearer picture of the past. They amount to White's fascinating, humorous creation. It's also true that while he does have an interest in ordinary people, this is far from a picture from the ground up. Our focus in the narration stays heavily with the elite and occasionally condescends to ordinary people. And when it does, we get a very idealized picture of ordinary people that either they love feudalism and it has no problems, especially when you have, you know, a good lord, or they're used for comic effect, but they don't really get to be real people.
Well, they do get brutally, they get brutalized, as we see in the Ill-Made Knight, right? That's discussed at some length, and the awful things that can happen to them, and they're described rather gratuitously. So we should say,
true, yes.
Yeah, it's not purely idealized. We should also
But then that's only to make a point to the ruling class about how they ought to treat the lesser thans. Right?
yes,
It's not
I
really
suppose
about
so.
giving things from their point of view. It's more like a lesson for the better rulers.
Well, one thing I think is interesting, at least with Uncle Dap's armory, is that it's not actually a jumble across time periods. It does try to be fairly concise. And so it's different than Merlin's study, which of course does have stuff from the 19th century and the 20th century. Uncle Dap, who gets very angry about the developments of Gothic armor, for example, he's trying, I think, for once, to position him at a certain place. And
Right.
that's why he has...
He's probably positioned in the 15th century
Yes.
there. But even the word Gothic gives us an anachronism, right? Because that's an 18th century description. So it's still kind of a hodgepodge in a way.
It is, yes. I think, but I mean, how else is he to describe that to us in a way that we can understand? So I think that that's an interesting place, and that's why he has recourse to sources, right? He goes back to that abbess who wrote a book on falconry, and says, these are the birds that were allowed to different emperors, if we can believe her. And I'm glad he says if we can believe her, because it's probably false, right? It's one of those things that's imagined in an abbey. You can create these hierarchies, but they're not going to be followed in the real world. I mean, who's going to stop a great duke from having an eagle if he wants one? You can't only have eagles for emperors. There are lots of eagles in the world, more than there are now, very probably. So anyone can have an eagle if they can take care of it and train it. The king can't be running around stopping people doing that. He's got other fish to fry. So I think it's interesting that he does this, and it's clear that White is familiar with his sources, right? He was very familiar with the medieval era, and his fascination with it is probably the primary driver of his inventory, such as they are. But I think that there is a pedagogical purpose behind them to some degree, even if some people find them tiresome. I like them. I think they're brilliant and clever, and but some people, you can imagine them flipping the pages and when do we get out of inventory mode? What about you, Lane? Are you fascinated by inventories, spreadsheets, quartermaster's reports?
It would depend on the subject. On arms and armor, yes, absolutely, because that is one of my special interests. But
not so much if we were reading White's big book of thimbles, perhaps. But
yeah, exactly.
Well, I think it's a book that's written. I suggest, although anyone can read anything, of course, but I suggest it's targeting young boys. And young boys typically have a fascination with medieval weapons and armor. And we can think of Lancelot being 15 years old, throwing his poises into the air. I think it's aimed for that kind of person, right? And Lancelot finds these things fascinating. And White finds them fascinating.
It's aimed at the English adolescent public school boy. That's who it's aimed at.
Yes. A person not unlike White himself, ultimately. Yes. And the democratization of education and the expansion of the middle class means that there are now more of the people who can sort of appreciate that, including us. None of us who ever went to a British public school. We certainly didn't grow up in the 1920s and 30s, but we can all, I think, appreciate this book. All right, well, let's turn our attention to the central matter of these first 8 chapters, and that is, in brief, Lancelot's love of Arthur, idealization of Arthur in his boyhood, and his desire to join the Round Table, and then his brief despair. The turning point of his life is when Merlin comes to castle, and he realizes that, or thinks that, Arthur has forgotten him and is making the Round Table without him. His arrival at the court and his meeting of a rival for his affections, which also Merlin let him know, which is in the person of Guinevere, whom he dislikes because he's sort of in love with Arthur. And we should understand this when White says this. He doesn't mean it as a romantic passionate sexual love. It's more of an idealization. It's a platonic love, but it's still a sort of totalizing thing. And he doesn't like having a rival for those affections in the person of Guinevere, especially because she didn't have to work for it, right? She's, as we find out later in the book, it was a maid marriage, but I'm sure Lancelot thinks it's just about her looks. And he worked.
I think it's a bit more ambiguous though than what you're suggesting.
How
I mean,
so?
within this first paragraph, we have Lancelot swinging his dumbbells fiercely and making his wordless noise, had been thinking of King Arthur with all his might. He was in love with him.
Yes.
And that was why he had been swinging the posies. There's also notes that White made for the Ill-Made Knight that have since been published. And amongst the notes about Lancelot, he says the following: homosexual? Question mark.
Oh.
Can a person be ambisexual, bisexual, or whatever? Question mark. His treatment of young boys like Gareth and Coat Mail Tail is very tender and profound. It seems to me that number 17 is the operative number on this list. What was the lack? There was definitely something, quote, wrong, unquote, with Lancelot in the common sense, and this is what turned him into a genius. It is very troublesome. That's his note.
That's interesting, right? Is that the...
I thought this very funny where he says, can a person be ambisexual, bisexual, or whatever?
Well,
Thought had never occurred to him.
well, to us, right? But of course, in White's society, that might well be a question he would have had.
Was he not familiar with Alexander?
It's entirely possible, at least not with that aspect of Alexander.
I don't know when that aspect of it entered into the scholarship of Alexander. So
I
that
suspect it was after
when
Brodel.
When the schoolboys were in British public schools, the boys would learn Greek and Latin. But when they encountered homosexual content, they were told not to translate those bits or to do it in such a way as to make it vague. So, I mean, there was a kind of awareness of it, but also an intentional, let's not talk about that.
Do you know that persists, persisted through the 20th century? The scholars who were brought up in that continued to do that in their translations, even when they were adults. And I've encountered this in reviewing translations. When I compare modern translations to older ones, I'm always frustrated by the not merely elusive, but complete elision of anything that is remarkable, that is remotely distant from heterosexuality.
Right.
Well, in any case.
So was that true in the, because I know Lancelot is a later addition to the Arthurian mythos from, I believe, French authors?
That's right, from the Lancelot Grail. Prose
So
Vulgate.
is that present in the original French creation of the Lancelot character?
No. Absolutely not. He's the central figure in the... He's the perfect figure, right? He's the Parsifal, the Galahad, the Arthur figure, the central perfect knight. He fills the courtesy role the way that Gawain fills it in the English and Welsh traditions. He fills the perfected knight role in the way that Percival fills it in the Germanic tradition. So he's kind of like the all-encompassing perfect figure. And although he's affiliated with Arthur's court, Arthur doesn't really come into it in the Lancelot Grail. It's kind of unimportant. It's Lancelot who's the central figure, and he's not an ill-made knight. He's a perfect knight, perfectly courteous, a dasher with the ladies. Not just Guinevere either, other ladies too. But as this enters the English tradition, especially by the time we get to Malory, it's all kind of pared down, and the character is refined as he enters the English tradition. This is why Malory often has recourse to his French book, which probably doesn't exist. It's sort of like a collection of memories and redactions and concretizations of French things that Malory read and then sort of collated in his mind. I mean, there may have been some French sources, and they may have been things that he read in French, but the French book that he often appeals to doesn't exist. At least not that we know of. Who knows? Maybe it's out there somewhere. some dusty archive, misfiled, as is often the case.
So I wonder where White, in that note, what is it that he read in Mallory that gave him that sense?
Well, in
about
Mallory,
Lancelot?
so in Mallory, I think you might be able to imaginatively draw that out, right? White is living in an era of psychoanalysis, and he brings this up again in this reading this week, right? He's talking about Sir Tarquin, and says, his friends would
Someone who needs to be psychoanalyzed.
Yeah, his friends would have insisted. He probably would have been locked in an asylum. Why? Because he strips off all of his prisoners and then whacks them. That's his hobby. Which is amusing, but then there are people who are into that as a hobby. So, in White's day, that would have been considered an aberrant disorder, and he probably should have been psychoanalyzed. And in any case, when White is thinking about these things and reading Mallory, and if we can think back to something that's also brought up at the beginning of this book, the healing of Sir Uri, one of the closing episodes in the Morte d'Arthur, right before, immediately before the Knight in the Cart and the beginning of the collapse of Camelot. That is when Lancelot performs his miracle. And when does it happen? It happens just after he's broken his vow and had recourse with the queen again. It's after it's just before Meleagant, or either just after or just before it. So it's in proximity narratively to Lancelot's failure to keep his knightly vows after the Grail quest, right? Which was the big thing. The Grail quest reminds him that he's imperfect in this way, and he resolves himself to no more sin with the queen, and he comes back and immediately does so. And then he needs to heal Sir Uri, and he doesn't want to even try because he's now doubly aware of his failure, right? The Grail has made him aware of it, and he's made this resolution not to sin again, and then he's done it. And now everyone hopes that he's going to be the pure knight who's going to heal Sir Uri, and he knows he can't. He's failed. He's failed God. Not once, but twice. And he's still failing God. He's going to go back to Guinevere again. He's a failure. He's a sinful man. He's an adulterer. He's unfaithful. He's been tested and found wanting. And so he does not want to heal Sir Uri. And they prevail upon him and prevail upon him and prevail upon him. And eventually, because he can't get the court to stop, he goes, all right, I'm going to put my hands on him. Nothing's going to happen, but I'll do it anyway. And he puts his hands on Uri, and he's healed. And Arthur and everyone is jubilant, of course, as we see in the list today. Everyone's cheering Lancelot. Lancelot, of course Lancelot could do it. We knew Lancelot could do it. And Lancelot weeps like a boy that was beaten because he knows inside the thing that we readers know, this complete failure. And there's something worse, that Lancelot knows that despite all those failures, and as awful as he thinks he is and knows he is, he's still the best knight in the world. So how bad must the others be? Right? It's not just he who has failed. The whole court has failed. The whole idea has failed. Virtue is not present in the Round Table. And that's a crushing, soul-destroying moment for Lancelot. Now, I think if we look at this picture and we're White, and we think about this episode, and we don't look at it as a matter of virtue, we could look at it as a matter of sexuality, right? That Uri has this seeping wound caused by penetration. He can only be healed by the touch of a man. You can imagine White sort of constructing a homosexual or homoerotic reading of this episode and then working it backwards into Lancelot's psyche. And then thinking of the French sources and Lancelot's success with ladies. And then thinking of his persistence with Guinevere, who is a figure of power, that these are kind of a channel for homosexual energy, right? That he becomes sort of manlier than manly as a way of dealing with his homosexual urges and like channeling them and like kind of repressing them and focusing them. So I could see White having a reading like that, and I'd be open to that reading from a student. It's just not the reading that I myself personally have, because I think the Grail quest is very important, and I take it as read. That it actually does. It is about virtue. It is about God. Not all scholars think that.
I think that makes sense. Yeah, and especially when you add into the equation White's own sense of being tortured about his own sexuality.
Yes, to the point that there's a sort of some self delusions or self obfuscation going on, an inability to recognize one's own sexuality, or a refusal perhaps to recognize one's own sexuality.
I get the sense that the Lancelot character goes through a transition not unlike in Brideshead Revisited, where the early love with Sebastian is called the forerunner of his mature love for Sebastian's sister. And so I think that, which was kind of a way that English schoolboys typically tried to explain this kind of phenomenon. It's a phase,
Yes,
associated with adolescence, and then you mature out of it.
exactly. And I think that's right. And we see that in Lancelot, because he's a boy until he goes to Arthur's court, and then he's a man. Uncle Dap is no longer his master. Uncle Dap is now his squire for the rest of his life, right? The roles have changed. He's no longer a page or a squire. He's a knight now, and he's going to be in Arthur's court. And his behavior changes completely. The Lancelot after the arrival in Arthur's court is a very different Lancelot than the Lancelot who's training to be a knight, who's almost sort of a nebulous fetal figure, right? He's kind of vague. He doesn't even speak properly, right? If we think about him singing his wordless, tuneless song, Tira Lira Lira, White says later in the text, right? Just kind of soundless noise, like yelling and throwing these poises up in the air. And then Uncle Dap, who is an eccentric, a genuine maestro, White says, which is sort of a term that Kenneth Clark would have used, I suspect. Right? A genuine maestro. He's even, he's so eccentric and obsessive about points of chivalry that sometimes Lancelot gets a slap in the face for being wrong on these points and arguing. Sometimes we're told Uncle Dap is tantalized into beating him, but Lancelot bore it. And so we see these things, and if you're thinking of the Lancelot of Malory, it's hard to imagine he would ever allow himself to be beaten. That's a very different Lancelot than the Lancelot who's a boy under the tutelage of Uncle Dap.
Well, I think that's right. And you're bringing up the point about his difficulty speaking, his tunelessness. Reminds me also of another feature of this that really stands out, which is this Lancelot is notably ugly. I mean, the point is made again and again and again, which is, I suppose, also part of this Freudian way of doing Lancelot to help try to explain some of what's weird and standoffish about him. He
looked like a Barbary ape.
Yeah.
Right?
Or Quasimodo. He's compared to Quasimodo.
Yeah. The thing I wonder, and I've read this book, I don't know, a dozen times now. Every time I encounter these descriptions, is Lancelot really ugly? Or is this Lancelot's understanding of himself that the narrator is simply presenting to us? And I've never been able to answer that to myself. It's White does this thing with studied ambiguity, right? Like with Arthur's lessons, which Arthur in adulthood and Merlin refer to as, those times that, we pretended, or you made me believe that, or, we talked about. But when Arthur is a child, and we're discussing the wart going into these things, they're presented as real by and large. Sometimes he wakes up in his bed and you've got Kay yelling at him, why were you making all those noises, like honking like a goose, right? And it seems clear to us that he was just in bed. But White does the same thing with Lancelot to an even greater degree. Is he really ugly? I mean, no one in the court ever mentions Lancelot's appearance. No one ever says, oh, that ugly knight. That never comes up at any point. And all the women are in love with him. Elaine's in love with him. The girl in his cell who wants to get him out and rescue him, she's kind of in love with him too. Right? Everybody is in love with him. Now, is White suggesting his martial prowess is so great, this is a Mallorean line, right, that his appearance is kind of irrelevant? Maybe, but he never says that. If that's what he means, we have to infer it. So I wonder, and I'll pitch this to our listeners and to you, is Lancelot really ugly? Or is this, as White describes at the beginning of The Ill-Made Knight, something in his psyche? He's convinced there's something wrong with him. And this goes back to White's, homosexual question mark reading. Is this Lancelot like seeing that in himself and kind of manifesting it as a hallucination of his visage, right? That he looks at himself and he sees this ugliness that derives from his sinful nature? Or is there something psychologically wrong with him, perhaps because of the abuse he suffers at the hands of Dap? Or is it because his parents don't seem particularly interested in him, right? He's just kind of tossed to his uncle, who is also sort of an eccentric. He's like the dog boy in a way, right? Remember the dog boy and his they end up in the woods together. And, there's this sort of way in which Lancelot and Uncle Dap are that eccentric pairing. What do we think? Lane, is Lancelot ugly?
So I actually wrote this down in my notes when I was looking at things to discuss. I don't know either, because an ugly Lancelot is such an inversion against the rest of, the Arthurian story, especially Mallory, which, we get a lot of White here saying, yeah, read your Mallory. You'll hear all about Lancelot's life. Very summary in that regard. But the ugly Lancelot is not what anyone thinks of for Lancelot. Lancelot is always, the handsome knight, the one that tempts the good wife of Arthur away from him. So I read it as, is this Lancelot just projecting his own insecurity outside of himself? He looks in the mirror and instead of seeing himself for what he is, it's like body dysmorphia. He sees, no, I see the ugliness within.
That's
and then
what it
White
could be.
just picks it up and carries it forward, because there's a sense, I don't know if White knew what body dysmorphia is. I don't think he did. But there's a sense in which, if we go back to Mallory and think about the Sir Uri episode, Lancelot's understanding of himself is truer, has to be truer, than anybody else's understanding of him. Now, that's not actually how reality works, right? We might think that we know ourselves better than anyone else, but we have our own blind spots with regard to ourselves. Some things we magnify, some things we are ignorant of, that people outside of us can see. But we do know a lot of secrets about ourselves and our lives that nobody else knows, and that can give us the sense that our vision of ourselves is truer. And if we're not very critical about that, we might come to believe it. And I wonder if that's what White is getting at with Lancelot. Lancelot's account of himself, his knowledge of his failings, is more complete than anyone outside of him. The rest of the world only knows his successes, but it's Lancelot alone who knows his failings. And so when he looks at himself, the account he sees is a truer account of the whole man. And that's what White wants to present us. The whole Lancelot, real Lancelot. And real Lancelot is ugly. Now, I should point out that this gets picked up in an unlikely place. In the Hallmark TV program, Merlin, which had Martin Short as an imp and Helena Bonham Carter as Morgana.
Sam Neill as Merlin.
Sam Neill as in the title role, and he did a very good job, I should point out. It's actually just about my favorite version of the Arthurian kind of epic ever filmed, because although it takes lots of liberties, it is relatively canonical, relatively speaking, right? And it gets at like some certain central ideas, and it does it in an agreeable and pleasant way, instead of a really, really, really weird way like Boorman's Excalibur, which I also love, but it's weird, deeply weird. Even weirder when you realize that his 13-year-old daughter is playing the naked dancing girl, right? It's a very, very weird thing. Anyway, in that Merlin, when Lancelot rides off with Guinevere, rescues her from the stake, he rides out of the court permanently in that story. He doesn't in Mallory or here. But then Merlin says, the thing I remember about Lancelot is that nothing he ever did was quite right. And I'd like to come back to that, because, that is the Chevalier mal fait, right? The ill-made knight. That there's always something, and Merlin in that Hallmark series is given a line that lets him know there was always something not quite right about everything Lancelot did. He wasn't perfect. He was perfectly imperfect. And I wonder, I maybe that's what White is giving us. You know, the Merlin series comes along 70 years, 60 years after White is writing this book. But maybe it's picked up on something there, that they've both got the same inspiration, that there's something imperfect about Lancelot. And we can manifest that in his self-image. But I think we see it in the text as well, right?
Oh, well, absolutely in this text. I mean, he's not only slightly imperfect, he's positively insufferable.
I wouldn't call him insufferable.
He's one of the most horrible characters I've ever had to read.
No, I won't stand for the most horrible character you've read. We've read more ghosts.
Oh my god, he's so insufferable. He's so narcissistic and self-obsessed and
narcissistic, really? Oh, Drew. I think
in a twisted way, because he always thinks that he's wrong and evil, but it's just a twisted narcissism. It's still self-obsession, but it's one that's like self-deprecating in the extreme.
You don't think it's humility?
That's the difference between true narcissism and this for me, is that he doesn't believe he's better than everyone when he's not. He believes he's worse than everyone when he's not.
Well, so remember his name in this book is given as Galahad Lancelot, right? And his son eventually will be called Galahad as well. And his son will be perfect. If you want an insufferable character, Drew, there's your Galahad is insufferable.
It can get worse.
Yeah, they're just degrees. Degrees of insufferability. I don't know. I think I've never found him insufferable. I found him very tragic, right? Because I'm one of the knights outside of Lancelot. I'm like one of the knights in the Round Table. When I look at Lancelot, I see the perfect knight who succeeds at everything, right? And yet we know how tortured he is by his own failings. I think what Lancelot doesn't understand is that everybody is tortured by those failings, and they give in. He doesn't, right? Gawain kills a woman. Lancelot would never kill a woman, right? They give in to their failings. The only failing that Lancelot ever gives into is Guinevere. Now, he gives in over and over again, chronically, right? He recants and takes a long sabbatical from the court and even goes mad and becomes a beast man and comes back and chastens himself to God, and then he gives in again. So he can't succeed at that. It's the one thing he can't triumph over. But in everything else, he does.
No, that for him to be tragic, for me, I've got to like him first. I don't have anything likable there to begin with. I mean, even when he talks about his aspirations as a boy, it's so self-aggrandizing, self-obsessed. You know, I wanted to be the greatest of the great, and I wanted to be able to work miracles so that I could be great, and I wanted to be a saint. Not because he ever says anything about wanting to, alleviate the suffering of other people. I mean, it's always about, I wanted to be great, in the sense of working miracles, in the sense of being a knight, in the sense of being a saint. So he's so like obsessed with himself.
Miracle, a modest miracle, just one. Right? He doesn't want to be a wonder worker. But he would like to do one small miracle, heal a blind man or something.
For his own sake, so that he can be great.
Yes. I think that's right. But think about his training, right? I mean, that's what he's being trained to do since he was a child, since he was, a babe in arms, was to be a man in arms.
It's certainly the case that the culture in which he's raised encourages that kind of thinking, and he exhibits it in spades.
To the nth degree. I mean, his teacher is a master of chivalry. And he spends every waking moment practicing for the day when he can utilize his abilities. White describes him as a sort of Bradman. Now, if you don't know cricket, Don Bradman is the greatest cricketer ever to play the game and probably the greatest sportsman ever to live, full stop, in any sport, if measured by standard deviations. The only one who comes in second place is Michael Jordan in basketball, but he's again, measured in standard deviations, miles behind Bradman. Bradman is so far, he's twice as good as the next best player ever to play the game, measured in averages, right? Bradman's final average in the game was 99.6. That means he scored a century nearly every time he went out to bat. And indeed, if he had scored 4 runs in his final innings, he would have had an average of 100. But his eyes were watering because he'd received a standing ovation from the crowd, and he was out first ball for a duck. So his average is 99.6. The next best would be someone who had averaged about 49.96 or 50. So you're talking about someone who's twice as good as anyone else ever to bat. He was amazing. And what did he do? Well, in his youth, being poor and living in Australia, he took a golf ball and a stump from a cricket, which is basically like a long dowel rod, and he would bounce the golf ball off the ground, off the wall of the house, and then hit it back again. And he'd just go around and around, never letting it drop. So it'd go ba-dunk, hit, ba-dunk, hit, ba-dunk, hit, doing this with a stump and a golf ball and never missing. Well, if you could do that with a tiny little ball and a tiny little stump, then how much easier is a big red ball and a giant whacking great bat going to be if you want to hit things? A nice flat bat. And that's exactly what he says about Lancelot, right? Lancelot's practicing with doubly heavy weapons at the quoits. He's practicing constantly in the most adverse circumstances so that when he actually has to do it, the weapons will feel light, the armor will feel light, it'll all be so easy. And it is. Now, White's probably thinking about Bradman and kind of reading this back onto Lancelot, in addition to grabbing some historical details. But we have to think about those kinds of figures. And why does Bradman do this? Why is he so good at cricket? Because he wanted to be the greatest cricketer of all time. And he succeeded. He is the greatest cricketer of all time. Still, to this day, it's been almost 100 years. So I think that there can be a place for ambition. I don't think Bradman's insufferable because he wanted to be the greatest at cricket. I don't know that Lancelot's insufferable because he wants to be top of the battling averages instead of the batting averages, right? It's
I'm not saying ambition makes people insufferable. I'm saying that's all I get from Lancelot. I don't get other endearing things. I just get this.
Oh, he loves Jenny. Well,
even so, there's another thing that I find difficult about this is, and I wonder if this is a difficulty of White as a writer. He's not really. He shouldn't write romance. The slip into falling in love with Guinevere just strikes me as not entirely believable, but I think that's because the narrator doesn't know how to depict somebody falling in love.
Well, maybe.
And I think we have a lot of, as I said, just summary of Lancelot's life. So we get a lot of his interiority. Mm-hmm. We get a lot of his thoughts and internal life, but we compress the events of his external life down to these very summary paragraphs. And so we get the sense of what he's thinking, but not how he is shaped by the events around him and how he's reacting to them, because they're all presented in summary.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a necessity, right? He has to get us up to the point where Lancelot can come to the court and where things start happening in the court.
There's a lot of exposition, and then there are just these little vignettes.
Yes.
Of plot, yeah.
Well, let's talk about the scene with Guinevere, right? I think it's revealing of something that's another signal change when Lancelot comes to the court. Lancelot comes to the court and he wants to be the greatest knight in the world. He stops being a boy and he goes to Arthur's court. I also particularly like how that's done, right? That Lancelot is totally unconcerned that Uncle Dap might be executed for letting him leave. He is self-prepossessed. Why? Because the whole motivation for his life, which White excuses by saying, this is how boys think. And I think he's quite right about this. That for them, weeks, months must seem an eternity when you're a 13-year-old boy, right? Your relative understanding of time is so limited because you've only been alive. You only have a memory of such a short period that to devote months and years of your life to another man's idea is an enormous sacrifice. He's basically devoted his life to this idea. And then he finds out that the round table might be filled up and there'd be no place for him. And he'll have done all this. He'll have given his life for nothing. And so in a panic that isn't a panic, right? A moment of resolve, he decides that he will leave. He has to become a man. He has to go to the court right now. And Uncle Dap goes with him, although this isn't clear at first. He says, they won't find out. You can stay here and they won't know. And then in the very next line at the beginning of the next chapter, they're in the boat together. So Uncle Dap goes with him and becomes his squire. That's wordlessly done. Perhaps it was wordlessly done in point of fact. Maybe just Uncle Lancelot went to leave and Uncle Dap was there and they didn't say anything and they just left. It was an understanding. But Lancelot is very cavalier about that. Dap says, they'll kill me if they know I could have prevented you leaving. And Lancelot says, they won't find out. Well, okay. Anyway, so he goes off, right? And he gets to England and he meets Jenny. And they're out with their falcons. And we know how fascinated White is with falconry. And we find this episode with the yarn and the string. And White has spent some time by this point explaining how it gets fouled up. And Jenny has tried to fix it for him. And she's done a bad job of it because she doesn't know about falconry. She doesn't know what she's doing. But she's done it because she wants to be helpful and she genuinely wants to help him. And his response to this is to snap at her. No, that's not it at all. It's totally wrong. And he grabs it from her. And he sees in her face in that moment a look of pain. Now, I want to actually read this section, and I've got to find it. That's the challenge. Do either of you happen to know what chapter this is in? Is it in
4, I believe.
4?
It's the end of 4.
Yeah, I think it's 4 also.
Okay. The thing is, I read the entire book, all of The Ill-Made Knight, and now I'm trying to keep in my head where all these things were. So this is chapter 4. Yes, here it is. Very end of chapter 4. He took the wretched ball away from her with a gesture which was almost rough. That's no good, he said. And he began to unwind her hopeful work with angry fingers. His eyebrows made a horrible scowl. There was a moment in which everything stood still. Guinevere stood, hurt in her heart. Lancelot, sensing her stillness, stood also. The hawk stopped baiting, and the leaves did not rustle. The young man knew in this moment that he had hurt a real person of his own age. He saw in her eyes that she thought he was hateful, and that he had surprised her badly. She had been given kindness, and he had returned it with unkindness. But the main thing was that she was a real person. She was not a minx, not deceitful, not designing and heartless. She was pretty Jenny, who could think and feel. Well, we've been talking about Lancelot as a narcissist. And maybe there's a certain...
That's a breakthrough moment for him.
That's a breakthrough moment for him.
He's finally seen that there's another person in the world besides himself.
And here's the problem. Maybe the only other person in the world besides himself. Right? Maybe that's the problem. We'll have to see as we go on. But that's it, right? Like, if you're a narcissist, the realization that another person exists must be shocking. And then to realize you've hurt them. There's got to be some sort of understanding, and it would be a shock if it's the first time you've ever had this understanding, that you can hurt other people, and what must that feel like? Now, for us, that's how we think all the time, right? We put ourselves in other people's shoes all the time, but imagine if this is your first time ever doing that. It must cut you to the quick. It must be like a body blow. And maybe that's what happens to Lancelot. Maybe that's how he does fall in love with Guinevere. What if she's the only other person in the world? What if she takes Arthur's place? Arthur was an ideal. He never met Arthur. Arthur was just a set of ideas far away in Gramarye. But Guinevere is a real person. I wonder about that.
Well, and this is how the narrator transitions from that moment, the realization that, oh, God, she's a real person, and I hurt her feelings. From that, we get to and that's the end of chapter 4. The very first sentence of chapter 5 is as follows. the first two people to notice that Lancelot and Guinevere were falling in love with each other were Uncle Dap and King Arthur himself. So we've just skipped over the falling in love bit because I think White has no idea how to depict that. From the realization that she's
there's also
real,
a narrative that also serves a narrative function, right? What do the sources say about them falling in love? They just
yes,
do.
Exactly. But if you're going to make a novel out of a medieval romance, then I think you've got to try a little harder to show, not just tell.
Maybe. I mean, but Merlin does something similar when it comes up with Arthur and Guinevere, right? When he's at the court trying to explain, how did it come to be that Arthur marries Guinevere, the daughter of King Leodegrance, is a maid marriage, etc. And Merlin says, well, it's just a thing that happens, and that's that. There's no point. They were always going to get married in his mind. He remembered it happening. And that's how the sources
I think
do
that
it.
White is stuck in the mindset of an adolescent public school boy.
You think so?
That's the kind of narrator we've got here. So falling in love just seems so foreign and weird that we've got to skip over that bit and just say that it happened.
But here's the question though. Is that the point of the book? And I'm not entirely convinced that it is. I mean, you said, maybe it was before the podcast, you said that White shouldn't write romance.
I said that
You said
in the
it was during.
recording.
Okay, so you said that. Is it though? Is it a romance novel? I think it's something like the opposite of a romance novel in some ways.
Oh, no, I agree. That's what I'm saying. There's romance that has to be in this because it's in his sources. So
Yes.
he puts it in there. But you can tell from the way he puts it in there that he would never choose to write a romance.
Yeah. And so I don't think it's a romance novel. When I say it's the opposite of a romance novel, what I mean is that in romance novels, the romance is the point and it's glorified. It might be difficult or you might struggle with it, but it's meant to be in conclusion. You're meant to look at the romance and say, oh, I wish I could experience something like that. But that's not what I think we're supposed to draw from the Ill-Made Knight. In fact, the romance part of it is torturous and awful and ultimately destructive.
And we do have one other romance that gets short shrift here, which is in chapter 4. And it's the last chapter that has Merlin in
Yes, Nimue.
And Merlin is visiting where Lancelot is being raised and has this brief conversation, and Nimue is there, and he gets led away by her, and that's the end of Merlin.
For now. unless you read the Book of Merlin when he comes back. Yes, and this is in Mallory, and it's in the sources, and the various sources deal with it in extended ways. So Tennyson, of course, devoted a whole book to Merlin and Vivian. And I think his version is really interesting and compelling. We talked a lot about it for that reason. If you want to go back and listen to that, we did an episode on Merlin and Vivian. Here, of course, she's going to take Merlin away and lead him off to a cave and seal him up in it. We don't really find out why. In Mallory, it's because Merlin's a kind of sex pest. And she wants to, he won't stop bothering her. And so she gets tired of him and locks him up in a cave. So I wonder, is it just so ancillary to what White is doing? It's only briefly mentioned in Mallory. It just gets like a line, right?
Yeah.
A couple sentences. And maybe White, who's trying to give us a sort of version of Mallory, feels he's content with taking a similarly minimal approach. But I would say that certainly not in Mallory, the romance between Merlin and Nimue is not of particular interest to him. So I don't know if we can fault White too much for not expanding.
No, I'm not faulting him for it. I understand he's giving little attention to it because Mallory gave little attention to it. But it's part of this larger pattern of all the romances sort of get shoved off stage. They're facts that are true that have to be in the story. But how they come
wait till you get to Lancelot and Elaine. I'll just say hang on, because he does deal with that. That's White's attempt to make a romance. And it's also, of course, tragic, right? I mean, it ends with the death of Elaine. She commits suicide.
Yes.
Or dies of grief, however you want to view it, right? But, she dies in any case. And then her body is placed in a barge which sails down the river and shames Guinevere. Because everybody knows by that point. It's unspoken, but everybody knows. And Lancelot has a child by her. And that's, of course, going to be Galahad. So all of these things link together. And that particular episode is interesting because, Lancelot is... Well, no, we can't talk about it now. It hasn't happened yet. We're not Merlin. We can't talk about Lancelot and Elaine.
While we're in chapter 5, I just want to point out about the Roman War.
Yes.
Which gets a paragraph.
It does.
And White makes a very big deal of emphasizing that Rome had a dictator called Lucius, not an emperor.
Yeah.
And so this is supposed to, I think, morally justify Arthur deposing him. And then later on, we have Lancelot refer to Arthur as the emperor.
Yes.
So he deposed a dictator to become the emperor. I suppose the emperor is supposed to be more legitimate, and dictator is supposed to mean illegitimate.
Well, I mean, imperator means both, right? It means
of course, but White's the one that's making a distinction that sounds moral. I mean, the linguistic distinction isn't moral.
No, I think you're absolutely right. And of course, in Lancelot's view, there is a moral difference, right? We don't have to share his view. But for him, there's absolutely a moral difference. Arthur is a good and just ruler, and Lucius is an unjust ruler. He wants an obligation that Gramarye doesn't feel it's obliged to provide. And this is what Mallory says, that Lucius basically demands tribute from the English Isles, and the English Isles say we're not held tribute to Rome. So that's what the war is fought over. Isn't it here where White says, if you want to read the whole thing, you can go look in Mallory. He does the same thing with Lancelot, too, doesn't he? Like, if you want to read all about Lancelot's adventures, Mallory does a good job of writing them all down, but I'll give you one.
Yes.
Then he actually gives us two. He doesn't give us one. But he does that, right? He's going to give us a vignette.
And we also get another inventory of all the allies that Arthur had.
Well, that's in Mallory. That's why, right? That's taken straight out of Mallory. And he even does his best to preserve the spelling and the original medieval names for places, right? And if you want...
I was wondering about that.
If you want our discussion of it, go listen to our episode on Mallory. I'm going to do what White does. We've discussed this in our episode on Mallory in the Roman War.
I think this raises a good point about how you're supposed to read this. I think that White is assuming his reader has definitely already read Mallory. Mm-hmm. Because there are many things that are funny about this that wouldn't be funny unless you had. So if you haven't read Mallory, stop reading this and go back and read Mallory and then come back.
I don't know if I found that to be,
yes, because the entire time I am comparing White's Lancelot against the other Lancelot characters that I have read about. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I don't know that this Lancelot can stand on his own unless you have some other versions of the Lancelot myth to compare him against.
It's
very sort of metatextual.
Yeah, I think you're quite right about that, Lane. You would lose a lot if this is your first reading of Arthurian literature and you have no idea who Lancelot is. So you've been living under a rock, and I guess you haven't even seen the terrible Richard Gere Lancelot in First Night, right? Who really is in some ways. I put
that one out of my mind.
And yet, in some ways, that terrible, terrible film captures, maybe better than any other film, like the ridiculous perfection of Lancelot, right? If you don't understand that, then you read this book, you wouldn't understand that there's something really subversive and against the grain going on. That any reader of Arthuriana, like bells and whistles and flashing lights should be going off when you see Lancelot looking in the upturned basin and seeing an ugly face, and when White describes him as a Barbary ape. and when he constantly talks of himself as ugly. It's deeply unusual. I mean, there's nothing else in Arthuriana that that is like this. It's totally White's own thing, and that is why we began this podcast reading with that point. Right? This is so important. Is Lancelot really ugly? And I don't think there's an answer to that question. You can only come to sort of, probably not, for these reasons, or probably so for these reasons. And then as a reader,
if he is ugly, there's something so charismatic about him, so magnetic about his person, that people are drawn to him despite his misshapen face.
And they never mention it, right? It never comes up.
It's almost like, in Gone with the Wind, Scarlett O'Hara is described as being quite plain looking, not ugly, but plain looking, but having so much personal charisma that everybody was attracted to her. But this is almost like that, except more so.
Yeah. I mean, able to carry a whole society with, and a society where personal appearance is almost everything, right? How you look as a knight, how you carry yourself is vital. And we know this because White spends a lot of time talking about it. Like, the knights can tell who each other are just by looking at the way they ride. So they're all very attentive to details of riding, details of coverture, details of personal grooming. And yet nobody ever mentions that Lancelot is a deeply ugly, misshapen person. I mean, Quasimodo-esque. I mean, I struggle. It's got to be internalized psychological trauma of some sort that is
I think that's a fair reading.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, the sands in the hourglass have run out. Listeners, it's real too. I see it's a real hourglass. I'm not joking. The sands of time sadly only flow in one direction. But we will be back next week with the next, 6 chapters of The Ill-Made Knight. It's chapters 9 through 18. That's 7? 9? My math is terrible. Is that 9 chapters? I think that's 9 chapters of The Ill-Made Knight.
I'm an English teacher. I don't count.
No, that's my problem. I have no idea. 6, 9, 15 chapters. Anyway, 9 to 18 next week, as we complete the next roughly 20% of the book. That's how I've done it in 5 parts. And do write in. We will be reading your comments, not in next week's episode, but in the week after that, because, of course, we record these 2 at a time. And you can watch us record them live or listen live if you're a member of our patrons Discord channel. And you can get that invite by becoming a patron. Head over to criticalreadings.com and click Become a Patron at the top of the page. We'll put your name in the credits for as long as you're a supporter. Thank you this week to my co-panelists. They were Lane Haygood.
Goodbye, as always.
And Dr. Drew Nathaniel Keene.
It's been a pleasure.
That's it for us. And as a reminder, all of these episodes are now available on YouTube. We put the link into our episode post on our website. So if you would like, you can head over there and click that viewing link, and you can watch this podcast online. We'll see you next week. Until then, from all of us here at Critical Readings, Godspeed.